Welcome to the Period Besties Podcast with Stasha and Katie. Think about it as chatting with your best friends about all the TMI stuff you've never talked about before with two period coaches who've been helping hormones collectively for over 20 years now. I'm Stasha.
And I'm Katie, and we're pulling back the curtain on what it's like in the world of menstrual coaching. From puberty to menopause and everything in between, we're here to show you how period coaching can save the day. We'll share practical tips and information you can put to immediate use to improve your hormones and happiness.
We're removing the mystery, ending the taboo, and shining a light on just how powerful period coaching can be.
So whether you need period coaching or are considering becoming a period coach yourself, these episodes are going to help you. We'll share stories, coach live on air, and bring smart, savvy guests to share their wisdom too. Let's start today's episode.
Welcome to today's Period Bestie Podcast episode, where we're doing something a little bit different. Today, we're talking about voting. It's an important conversation to have, especially since this year, in particular, women's rights are on the ballot. And as people who are here every day, advocating for you to help and advocate for yourself and have conversations with your doctors and testing and access to things. This current legislation is making that hard, if not impossible, for some people. So voting has become a conversation that needs to be had in this country more often, and especially for women, because this is not something we've had for a long time. And you may not know. So Katie and I put together a little bit of like a historical crash course on voting rights for women and access to things like birth control, reproductive rights, and a few little bonus facts, because the perspective, I think, helps when you realize how little we've had the rights that we've had and how important they are. And I'm hoping that this will encourage you to go register, vote, and we'll have resources at the end as well for that. So just to let you know that it's been almost a century where women have been fighting for voting rights. It was 1847 when the first convention for women's rights was held. It was held in Seneca Falls, New York. And that's a long time to be fighting. And as you'll see, as we go through this little bit of history, it took a very long time to get that right to vote. So that first convention was held in 1847. And in 1849, so 2 years later, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held. And this had people like Sojourner Truth, who, if you don't know, go Google, and Frederick Douglass, who's another amazing American hero that you need to go and Google if you don't know him, were in attendance. So at the beginning of the women's rights movement, it was intersectional. And over the history, which we didn't go too deep into, you can see where it ebbs and flows, intersectionality in women's rights. So we're just basically doing a little history right here of how things played out without taking too many detours for the sake of keeping this brief and positive.
Right? I mean, I think it's fascinating that my grandmother was born in 1919. And she was born without the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
That was my grandmother. Yeah. Sadly, she's no longer with us. I think she would be 106 years old. She was with us till she was 97, had incredible stories, and would talk about just being a woman and being a very fearless woman. She was a nurse. She went to nursing school. She was in the Navy. She was a Navy nurse, but she couldn't marry my grandfather if she was a Navy nurse. So she had to quit the service because she wanted to marry my grandfather, and she could be a nurse. She just couldn't be a nurse in the Navy as a married woman. I always think of that because my grandmother, they got married in 1943. Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly. So that's not that long ago that they got married, and she had to quit being a Navy nurse, and she loved that. That's how they met.
Yeah, these things are in recent history, right? I mean, the fight began a century ago. Mm-hmm. The actual gaining of rights is very recent. Yeah. And it's funny how history repeats itself as well. So in 1870, there was the anti-suffragette movement, which was essentially the modern trad wife movement. It literally declared that women should not be participating in politics or have the right to vote or anything to that effect because it would distract them from their important roles as wives and mothers. And here we are back again with the modern trad wife movement that's doing the same thing. You know, if you vote, you should be voting as your husband tells you to. Otherwise, you should just allow the head of your household, the man, to vote. And there are people who are out there, women included, who are out there saying that today. So history is repeating itself here in this moment.
Yeah, unfortunately, that happens all the time, right?
Yeah.
We think we learn and then we go backwards.
Yeah.
So let's move forward, right? I think the overall intention of this today is that everybody have a plan in place to make sure that you're voting. And we're going to keep talking about that during our time together today, but it's just make a plan. I moved last year. I made sure I've checked 3 times on the website. I'm trying to remember, is it vote.org? I think
Yeah.
where you can just, vote.org. I'm like, okay, I said I was registered, like I'm okay, but I've checked like 3 times to make sure that I'm registered and I know where to vote, because this is a new place for me to be voting in North Carolina. It's very different than California. They don't send you automatic absentee ballots. Like you have to make a plan. So for everyone listening, as we're going through history, just keep in the back of your mind, what's my voting plan? What times do I have? Am I taking the kids? No, I'm going as soon as I drop them off at school. So like really think about plans. If you need a ride, call Uber, call a friend, do not call Uber, but go on your app, just get support. And every town does usually, quote unquote, right, have transportation for people that need to vote. So you can look into that, call the city, the town hall, and see if you can get transportation if you cannot get there.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. Or mail-in ballot. There's a lot of states have mail-in ballots. And that's very true. When I was living in Florida, I was purged from the voter rolls. So I registered to vote when I moved my address to Florida. And then a year later, before one of the elections, I checked and I had been purged from the system and I had to re-register. So I voted in Florida, went back just to double check, and found out I had been purged before the next election cycle. So depending on your state, you may need to compulsively check a number of times because some states do occasionally purge the voter registration rolls. But yeah, vote.org is actually one of the resources that I have for this episode that will be in the show notes. And it has state by state information. If you have to register in advance, some states you have to register 30 days in advance. However, you can cast a provisional ballot. So you can still go and vote. It just may, if there's a close contestant in your state, like if it's close, then they'll go into the provisional ballots and use you to help break the ties. So it still can matter. It can still make a big difference, especially if you're in a swing state. Even if you missed a deadline, you can still get out there and check it out and make sure that you're going to be able to get into it. And the first woman who voted illegally.
I know. I'm like, let's get back to our history lesson.
Right? Susan B. Anthony registered and voted in the presidential election in 1871. She was arrested, tried, and convicted for voter fraud because we don't do voter fraud in this country. But at the time, it was a protest vote. She knew she was going to be arrested. She knew that she was going to be convicted for it, but she was making a point. And she, obviously became part of a lot of the movements going forward in order to do that. And she's not the only one. One of the very famous women who was arrested for protesting was Alice Paul in 1917. She was arrested at one of the protests for the right to vote and convicted with many people, but she went on a hunger strike. And so sometimes you see the newspaper articles with the cartoon of her being force-fed because she went on a hunger strike. So sometimes when you see old suffragette things, there's a cartoonist. It's not a funny cartoon, but it's the drawing of her being force-fed in jail. But part of the reason that it made a difference was because the journalists got involved at that point. And with Alice Paul, that was when journalists started actually taking note and talking about it. So journalism really did help push the movement forward, which was great. So it was 1917 and Alice Paul did that. And then it took a couple of years until 1920 when women actually finally got the right to vote. So there were a couple amendments in between where men were allowed to vote. And I think it was the 14th Amendment that it talked about how men, regardless of race or slave status, were allowed to vote. So there were a few things that moved forward in those couple of years. And then finally, women got the right to vote in 1920. So it's within 1920. We're in 2024, 4-year
Not
difference
that long
here.
ago.
It's only been a century that we got there. So it took us a century of fighting for the right to vote before we got to the right to vote. And now we have politicians who are publicly on record saying that they would like to take away the right to vote for women. So we have politicians today saying that it's time to remove that amendment and take away the right to vote for women. So it took us a century to get it. And it can take just one day to lose it if we're not voting. And at the local level, right? It's not just the president that matters. The president can't do anything about amendments or ratifying the Constitution. That's not what they do. That's not their job. That's Congress, your House representatives, your senators. Those are the people that actually make the laws, pass the laws. So you really need to be voting at that level. But even more importantly, we need to be voting at the state level for things like your local sheriff, your local school board, your local governors, all of your
Local judges.
Judges, yes, exactly. I always used to think about this in Los Angeles because the LAPD does not have a good track record on racism. And I used to just look to see who was running for sheriff, because if there was going to be any change in the LAPD, it had to be in the sheriff's office. So every election, I went through who was running and really deep dived into them. I talked to friends and made sure I understood who was running so that I could vote for somebody who could potentially help reform the LAPD. But it's not easy. So you do need to. You don't want banned books in your schools, then you need to elect school board representatives that are not going to ban books, right? So that local level is really, really important. And since they overturned Roe versus Wade, that local level is even more important. That's why we have states in this country that are refusing not just abortion care and miscarriage care, right? Because miscarriages are often, there's women in jail for having miscarriages. And there have been since before Roe versus Wade was turned over. This is something that's been happening, whether you're aware of it or not. Actually, I have a bit about it in The Revolution Will Be Bloody if you want more information on that. But women have been jailed for miscarriages forever, but now it's going up exponentially because they're using it as an abortion terminology for having a miscarriage, because often you need a D&C or you need some kind of medical intervention after a miscarriage in a lot of cases. So they're definitely using it to jail and persecute women, as well as coming after birth control, Plan B, things that we don't necessarily use just for pregnancy prevention, things that we use for helping deal with painful periods, for helping deal with cysts and fibroids. Birth control has a lot of more application than just pregnancy prevention. In fact, I think it's something like over half of the people using birth control are using it for non-pregnancy related things. Don't quote me on that, but it's a really big percentage of people who are on birth control, and it's not for pregnancy prevention. And they are actively making it legal so that pharmacies don't have to prescribe you birth control. And that's at the state level. So don't think of this election as just the presidential election. It really goes all the way down to like your local neighborhood council, and it matters.
And I think that everyone always, well, I feel like election cycles, it's always kind of been about the president, right? Yeah. But I would say the last 12 years, really noticing how important, the older I get, right? Really noticing the importance of the local, and especially these past 4 years.
Yeah.
Past 8 years. And it might be because we have more access and we know more about what's going on state by state, that I'm more aware and that we're all more aware of it, versus when I first started voting when I was 18, right? Like things are very different and there's more information, there's more knowledge, but the state level, and I just want to go back to birth control for a second, and we're going to give you all a history lesson on that too. But if you think about it, whenever you go to the doctor and you're complaining about acne, or you're complaining about, a lot of our clients are getting put on birth control because of perimenopause. Just think of every time you've gone to the doctor and they've suggested you go on birth control. Then think about how many people are actually on it for not the prevention of pregnancy. I think that's a good way to think about it, because if that's what they're prescribing all the time, right, for all these other things, then think about the percentage of people that are on it and not preventing pregnancy.
Yeah. And we only gained that right in the recent history, right? 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut was when they actually allowed married couples to get birth control. So only married couples, right? Exactly. Only married couples could have access to contraception. And then it wasn't until 1972 that you finally see a legal case passed that extended the right to contraception to unmarried individuals. So it's only 1972 that
72.
you could
I
get
was born in 79.
Right?
Yeah.
That was it. That was the first time that as a single woman, you could have access to birth control.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then Roe versus Wade was in 1973, only 51 years ago.
Yeah.
And we all know what happened to that.
Right. I mean, that's our lifetime.
Yes.
That's within the lifetimes of many, 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 many people.
Yeah. And many people working so hard to get that passed not so long ago that are still alive and saw it dismantled.
Yeah. When you talk to the women who fought for these rights, they talked about how many women died in unsafe abortion practices, because of miscarriages, because they couldn't get the DNC that they needed, because they went septic, because of the complications that came up from it. And now we're seeing it happen again. Right? We're seeing every day a new article about a woman being turned away from an emergency room because she was hemorrhaging. And they were like, well, that's too close to abortion, so we're not going to do anything about it. Like, we see so many women who are permanently infertile now because they couldn't have access to the care they needed when they
This should not be happening ever.
So we're going right back to that time where women are dying, becoming infertile, going septic, having lifelong complications because they're being denied their right to medical care. And the states are confused because there's no across the board information. And those states where this is happening, the doctors are leaving. They can't practice. They can't save lives. They can't help their people that they swore an oath to help. They swore the Hippocratic Oath, and they are being forced to talk to a lawyer before doing what they know is a very simple and easy procedure that could save this person's life, health, long-term health, whatever. And so a lot of these states already have high women and infant mortality rates. And now the doctors are leaving, so those rates are even going higher. And now women aren't able to even get regular pap smears or cancer screenings or any of those things because the doctors are leaving. Yeah.
We need good doctors.
Yeah.
Everyone deserves to have a good doctor to support them and guide them. That is a basic right. I
absolutely
truly believe that. And you'll watch the debates. It came up in the vice president debate. I feel like it's one of those things where just pay attention to what people are saying, but not really saying.
Well, and one of the things that came out of the suffragette movement was the League of Women Voters. So in 1920, when the amendment was ratified, the League of Women Voters was formed. And it was formed in part from all of the different suffragette factions coming together. And it still exists today. It's still something that exists today. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit, grassroots run organization. It's nationwide. There's chapters in every state. In most cities, there's something like over 700 chapters in the League of Women Voters. So you can get into your local level in the League of Women Voters. But my favorite part about it is they do help you understand what's going on. They keep track of politicians' voting records and whatnot. And they put out voting guides to help you understand your ballot. This is why you want to find your local chapter, because it'll have your local ballot initiatives and those kinds of things on it. It'll help you understand who's running. And they focus on not just women's health and women's rights, But they also talk about affordable healthcare, climate change, anti-racist legislation, and continuing to have voting access rights. So we just mentioned that some states are talking about taking rights for women to vote away, but they're also focusing on making sure that we maintain and gain voting rights for people. So they're part of all of making sure that we understand all of that as well. So I find it to be a very comprehensive voting resource. They also have information on state to state stuff like vote.org does. But I use them often to help me understand who's running and what their voting history is. Because a lot of politicians out there will say, just in the recent history, the governor of Florida was like, we need FEMA's help. But the day before the hurricane hit, he had voted down funding for FEMA. He was publicly saying we need more help from FEMA, but in reality, he was voting down access and money and finances to FEMA. So you may hear things, but their voting record shows something else. So knowing what their actual voting record is when it really actually matters, that vote is what actually matters. You can see what their history shows. So
exactly. That's why when you're listening to these sound clips, right? Making sure that you look and research who have they actually voted for? What have they voted for? So you know what they stand for, not what just they're saying in that moment of time.
Yeah. And it all matters. We also very recently, 50 years ago, 1974, finally were able to get a bank account, a credit card, these things without a man's signature on it. So it was only 50 years ago. Talk to your mom, talk to your grandparents, because they probably couldn't have a bank account or a credit card or get a loan or anything without a man's signature on it. It's on the ballot. Again, these kinds of things, these accesses, you think, oh gosh, no, that's never going to change. But the fact of the matter is that it can change and it will change. It's like saying it's something that you may have heard in the last couple election cycles, voting for the president is voting for the Supreme Court. That's 100% true.
Yeah.
It's when you're voting for the president, you're voting for the Supreme Court. And as you can see, the Supreme Court really matters. And the Supreme Court is a lifelong position. It's very hard to get someone removed from the Supreme Court. In fact, I don't think it's ever actually been done. So if somebody's on the Supreme Court, that's who we're stuck with for the rest of our potential lifetimes. So voting for your president, even if you're not on board with all of their policies, which you never will be, there's no one that's ever going to run for president that you're going to be like, he ticks all my boxes or she ticks all the boxes. That's never going to happen. But you're voting for the Supreme Court when you vote for the president. So which presidential candidate is going to put somebody on that Supreme Court that is going to further those anti-racist, those women's rights, those legal rights for minorities, for all that kind of stuff? Who's going to help support that versus who's going to take them away? Now we have factual evidence of who's taking those rights away. It has happened. So there's no debate on that.
Yeah.
Who do you want on the Supreme Court in the next turnover position? That's who you're voting president more than anything else when it comes to the presidential seat.
100%. Yeah. And that's the thing. You're never going to like somebody 100% ever. No. So do your research, please. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to tell anyone who you're voting for either.
No, you don't.
So do your research and go vote, right? It doesn't have to be who anyone else is voting for or whoever in your circle or your community. Vote for what you want. I think that's so important. I feel like we just get easily swayed these days, right? Especially if you're scrolling on social media and you're just listening to sound bites. Do your research and vote. And you don't have to tell anybody who you vote for.
There's not really such a thing anymore as single issue voting. You really need to think outside of just your own bubble and how are we going to lift this nation up? How are we going to lift the people up? I mean, I got to tell you, almost every day, I'm like, I'm going to make an account that's just me screaming about how we should have universal health care. It is the bee in my bonnet on a daily basis. It makes me so angry.
It makes no sense.
But there's a clear candidate out there who has tried to dismantle the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and has tried to get rid of it. And so it's women's rights. Women are dying, voter rights. All of these things accumulate, right? So when you're looking at candidates, you're not going to get somebody who ticks all your boxes, but who's going to tick more of them? That's really what it comes down to.
And something also to think about is if you're past the stage of life where birth control is essential, we also have to think about HRT.
Yeah.
Right. And bioidentical hormones, all the buzzwords, right?
Good point.
These are also women's rights. And we'll do a little quick history lesson about that. So it wasn't until 1940 that the FDA approved the first hormone replacement therapy drugs, right? 1940. Again, not that long ago.
No.
Right. And then it wasn't until the 1950s when HRT was first used clinically to treat menopause. There were studies that linked HRT to increased risk of endometrial cancer. So progesterone was added. 1970s, that was when progesterone was added. Okay. And we've been talking a lot about perimenopause lately. So this is very essential and important too. Then the 90s, HRT became very popular. Then we've all heard about that Women's Health Initiative study in 2002 that said that HRT had more risk than benefit. And this led to a drop in HRT. Now we have to talk about studies here for a second. How do studies actually get done? Studies are funded by the government. In order to get a study funded, you have to have somebody in the government request and say, this is something that needs to be studied, which is why women's health has not really been studied historically, correct? So when you're thinking about voting, you also want to think about your health and what is going to help you long term, right? Because women were not included in studies. So we want to be really mindful about who we're voting for. And the more women that we vote for have different health concerns than men, right? And bring these up in conversation and secure the funding and get things moving and grooving in this country if you wanted one of the studies done. So we want to really think about that, because this was that big study. All of the articles about it did not tell the whole truth about what was happening, which is why HRT declined and more women were suffering through perimenopause and menopause, and osteoporosis increased and Alzheimer's and dementia, and all of these things happened because of this one study, and then how it wasn't really reported well, we'll say. And again, that's why it's so important to do your research. And it's so important to elect more women, because we're going to have more studies for women, especially endometriosis, right? Things that are not studied enough. Okay. So I think that's also something really essential when we think about the history of hormones and women's health. It's not just birth control, right? It's about longevity for our health and how we can support ourselves. And HRT, it goes into that mix.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're so right about endometriosis, PCOS. There's so many issues that in just the last couple of years, they have finally started getting some funding for studies. And we're so far behind that those studies aren't giving you any kind of practical results. Those studies are just like, how does this even happen? There's studies that aren't going to give us practical, useful information for years to come. But if we don't have people in government to advocate for those studies, we'll never get to the point where those studies go, okay, here's how we can reduce the effects of endometriosis. This is how we can help reduce the infertility issues in PCOS. This is how we can stop the androgen growth. Like all of these different things, we're not even going to get to the how do we fix this until we can get through those studies. So we've got a long time ahead of us, and it doesn't have to be as long if we can get more funding. If we can take some of those multiple hundreds of studies into Viagra and maybe channel a few of them over into women's health, would be a great start, frankly. But yeah, and
minimally.
It wasn't until last year that they really started doing HRT studies with the HRT that exists now, not the HRT that exists 20 years ago. So the lower doses of estrogen, the more bioidentical forms of estrogen and progesterone and those kinds of things. So we're only now even getting studies on our current HRT hormones. So of course, now the studies coming out are totally different. because they're different hormones, they're different drugs that we're using and helping and to support. So of course we talk about lifestyle and food and eating and health and everything on this podcast, because that's the stuff that we have control of right now, that we can do something about right now, that we know works. But for these other issues, we need funding, we need studies, we need information. And some of the studies are just going to say what we already knew. Like we'll have studies that come out that say PCOS benefits from insulin resistant diets. We'll get those studies, they'll confirm what we know. But we'll also have more available understanding, like how does it start in the first place? Can we prevent it from getting started in the first place? Is the genetic component that we can deal with? Like all of those things that we can get down the line if we have the money and resources going to it. And that comes down to voting.
Yes. So make a plan, check your state. Some you can register to vote same day that you vote. If you need a ride, ask a friend, call a town hall, call the city hall. If you don't know where to vote, if you don't know where your voting place is and you missed it in the mail, you can call and find out. Go to vote.org, make sure you're registered to vote in the state that you live. So you can register the day of, right? Like you can vote the day of, excuse me, and just really make a plan, do your research. Where we have time to do that. Check out some of the resources in the show notes so that you can just click on a link and do some research and just vote. We haven't had the right to vote for that long. I have been voting since 18. I was like, I cannot wait to vote. I have the right to do this. It feels like such an privilege because I know other women around the world do not have the right to vote. And I take it very seriously. And I think just vote, right? I think like we just want everybody to vote. All the women vote.
Yeah. All of those are excellent suggestions. And I'm just going to add one thing. I love to download the sample ballot. So I know what's coming up on my local election ballot so that I can look up each individual person, initiative, whatever. So you can also jump in and see what your ballot is going to look like. So I often fill out my sample ballot so that I can just go in to vote and just copy exactly what I put on my sample ballot over to the ballot itself so that I'm not standing there going, what are these 10 initiatives? I don't understand what they are.
That's such a good point. I feel like because living in LA for so long, they just send you one, but not every state they do. So definitely go download. Yeah, this is my first time voting outside of New York City and LA. In New Hampshire, I voted first in New Hampshire, but that was a long time ago.
Same. I voted in New York and Los Angeles until 2020 when I went to take care of my parents in Florida. And I voted in Florida, and I got a real awakening of what voting is like in a non-blue voter informed state. It was really hard. Thankfully, my parents have been active voters for a long time. So I just cheated off of my parents. cheat sheet.
But that's why it's so imperative to make a plan so you know where your voting is.
Exactly.
If you're registered.
Yep.
Your research. We have time. This is it's so important to vote. It's so important to do your research before you vote as well.
Yeah. All right. I hope this helps. Check the show notes, get the links, enjoy, go vote, and just remember how hard people fought for a century to get you that right to vote. Honor those people, honor those women who did all of the fighting, the protesting, the being willing to be jailed, being willing to lose their lives in the process to gain this right to vote, and honor them. Go vote. And with that, thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now. A big shout out and thank you to our sponsors for today's episode, Period Coaching School and Katie Bressek Wellness.
Thanks to you, our favorite bestie, for listening to the Period Besties Podcast, where no topic is TMI. And of course, share this episode with your besties.
Remember to leave us a 5-star review, nothing less than the best for us besties, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
You can follow us on Instagram at Stasha Washburn and at Katie Bressek, or email us at periodbestiespodcast@gmail.com.
Check out more about us at katiebressek.com and periodcoachingschool.com. And of course, check the show notes for free goodies and extras that support this episode.
We'll see you on the next episode.
Bye for now, besties.